so I'm going to start us promptly and try and keep us close to the schedule. Since these are new committee structures, the first thing we have to do is to appoint a chair of a committee. And so, in our gulag-like manner, we put forward a motion to make David Tucker the chair of the committee.
I'll second that.
I appreciate that. All right. So I suppose we need to take a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Okay. So now I'm officially the chair, and therefore I will do the most important thing of the chair, which is to suggest that we approve the minutes from the meeting last December. So we met jointly, the cost trends and market performance and the chief committees met on December 6th. And so we all have the minutes for those. And so we need to approve those minutes. All those in favor? Any opposition? Okay. So let me talk about what it is that we are going to do in this meeting. We've got a few different things. So as you know, at our last commission meeting, we had a discussion about the BI data presentation, just what was going on. And since this is so complicated, what we want to be able to do is to keep discussing it in various forums. And so one of the issues that's important for the HPC and that seems appropriate to discuss here is evidence on past transactions that have involved those targets and what it is we learned from them. These will obviously be part of our final report, but I think it's good to get a chance to air those and to have a discussion of them both in terms of what we learned and what we would like to learn as we keep going forward through this. So that's the first thing that we'll do. We'll then come back to some issues associated with the cost trends report and particularly some of the provider price variation issues that have, or practice variation issues that have come up. So we'll deal with that. And then there are a couple of things that are in the nature of the regulations that we have to put out, having to do with registration of provider organizations and out-of-state transactions. These are things that we have to do for two reasons. One is we have to approve some of them formally, is that correct?
Neither of these require a vote.
I see, neither of them require a vote. But I think it's important that we take the time to explain them and introduce to people what it is that we're doing and stuff. So we will come back to both of those. So that's our agenda for the next approximately hour and a half. Why don't I start us off by turning it over to Kate, who's going to lead us through the past transactions.
Thank you, Dr. Cutler. So as we discussed in last year's cost trends hearing and at the CTMP meeting last fall, as a complement to the HPC's review of proposed transactions, we've also been tracking the performance of systems after they've engaged in significant transactions, both to see how performance has or has not changed, and to determine the extent to which they followed through on their plans and on commitments they've made publicly. So this slide substantially mirrors a slide that we showed back in October, listing some of the metrics that we've been tracking, in particular for hospitals that have either been acquired by or have started contracting through a new system since 2012. At the October 18th CTMP meeting, we talked about how community hospitals that have been acquired by or affiliated with new systems have done at retaining community-appropriate care at the community hospital versus, for example, seeing that care shift to more expensive settings like teaching hospitals and academic medical centers. We're going to show some of those same slides here because they are still part of this conversation, but we also wanted to share some trends across some of these other metrics, specifically the ones you see highlighted here: inpatient net patient service revenue per case mix adjusted discharge, which you can kind of think of as a proxy for an inpatient acuity adjusted price across all payers. So it does embed some degree of payer mix. Inpatient costs per case mix adjusted discharge, and by costs here we're referring to the hospital's costs, so overhead costs, not costs to us consumers in the Commonwealth. Case mix index, or the intensity of patients that hospitals are serving, and their occupancy rates.
Can I we going to show that just for the commercial payers?
No, this is across all payers.
We may want to subset it to commercial payers because we don't want, if they happen to receive fewer Medicare patients and more commercial patients, we don't want to say, well, the price is not, I mean, it has gone up, but we keep commercial space.
Absolutely. So you'll see one of the other metrics that is not highlighted, which we're not going to talk about today, but which we have been working on, is looking at relative price and composite relative price percentile. That is within each payer. And so we're kind of looking at it both ways. One of the other kind of important things to note is we're not comparing one hospital to another hospital. And so yes, it will embed some degree of payer mix, but if the payer mix isn't shifting, it's still should be
we can do it
reflected.
with it, right? If we can do it without that.
Great, absolutely. And so today we wanted to focus particularly on those hospitals, as Dr. Pepper said, that have affiliated with or been acquired by the Beth Israel or Leahy systems, recognizing obviously that we are reviewing the proposed merger of those systems now, and so their past performance may be informative in understanding what may happen in the future if they were to merge. And so we're just going to show some initial trend lines today. We don't draw any high-level conclusions, but you can think of this exercise as essentially trying to fill in a grid like the one that you see here, where we would be looking at how each of these systems has done on each measure across the hospitals that they have either acquired or starting contract with. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Katzen, Project Manager for Market Performance, to walk through some of the trends that we've observed.
Thank you, Kate. So starting, this is a slide that we did also see in October, and it shows changes over time in the share of community appropriate discharges at all community hospitals statewide and then all teaching hospitals and AMCs statewide. I want to take a moment to remind everyone, all of us, about the methodology that's happening here. So what we did to think about what are community appropriate discharges was to identify a very conservative list. That is to say, a list that we feel reasonably confident any community hospital in the Commonwealth could handle. And so there are many hospitals in the Commonwealth that could handle higher acuity than what this list comprises. But that way we feel like it's reasonably fair. And I'll note that throughout this presentation and when we did this in October as well, we also show sort of the inverse. So we show the share of community appropriate discharges, and then we show the other discharges, the share of those as well. So to the extent that a hospital is switching from lower acuity community appropriate discharges to having higher acuity care, you would expect to see that reflected in that other data. So you can watch for that as we go through the slides. The other important thing about the methodology is that we are looking at shares of the discharges in a community hospital's primary service area. So if the total number is changing over time, and we know that a lot of inpatient care is shifting to outpatient care. So if that total is changing, that shouldn't affect this because we're looking at the share of those that are going to different hospitals. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Great. So yes. So the other sort of statewide measure that I wanted us to review here is statewide case mix index. So you can see that this has been going up over time, both for community hospitals on average and for teaching hospitals and AMCs on average, going up a little faster for teaching hospitals and AMCs. So just, we'll reference this back a little bit as we go through, but just keep in mind the statewide trends, everyone on average, case mix index is going up over time. So the first community hospital that we want to look at today is Lawrence General. Lawrence General entered a contracting affiliation with BIDCO, Beth Israel Deaconess Care Organization, in 2014. So we see here that Lawrence General did experience a decline in its share of community appropriate discharges, again, in its service area after this affiliation. That decline was faster than the statewide trend over this period. And the share of community appropriate discharges going to teaching hospitals and AMCs, and that orange line is all of them together, was increasing during this time a little bit faster than the statewide trend. That wasn't driven by any particular hospital getting a higher share. So we saw so there was a little bit of an increase of Lakey during this period, but there's no standout entity that was sort of benefiting from that. Great. So now we have the yes.
So, and is that statistically significant? I mean, when you look at the the data, it's like a little less than 48 to 44. So
Absolutely.
and then the real dip occurred, it looked like, in 2012 before this affiliation happened. So
Yeah. Absolutely. So we are analyzing this data in a number of different ways. One of them is just sort of seeing how the trend for that community hospital compared to the trend for community hospitals statewide. The other thing we're doing, and we don't show that here because it would be a whole presentation unto itself, and we're doing other things today, but we are also looking to say, well, what was the trend before the transaction happened? What was that trend line? And what would have happened if that trend had continued just linearly forward in time? And then comparing that last year data point, the 2016, to what actually happened. So if the pre-transaction trend had kept going, 2016, where would it have been? And then how does that compare to reality? And then we're able to use confidence intervals to assess whether the difference between those two endpoints is statistically different. So we are in the process of doing that analysis now. What I will tell you is that because there are not, I'm not a statistician, but what I have been given to understand and what makes sense to me is that because we don't have a large number of data points, like the total number is just small, we don't have a lot of degrees of freedom. So it's very hard to find statistical significance when just the total number of data points is small. And so we don't see it in very many instances. And I have to tell you, I do not recall what was true about this one. But what I will say is that the research and cost trends team is in the process of developing other ways to cut this data down, and that should generate more data points, essentially by looking at the data by quarter instead of by year. And I have a hope that then we'll have an ability to sort of more robustly and more fairly assess significance. Is that helpful?
it is. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you for the question. Right, so looking at the non-CAD discharges, so again, these are the higher acuity discharges. Lawrence General, we do see an increase in Lawrence General's share of these discharges leading up to the transaction, and then it flattens afterwards. So we aren't seeing Lawrence General making up the difference in its loss in share of community appropriate discharges in that time after 2014. So moving on to case mix, this is a new slide. We do see that Lawrence General's case mix has been increasing since 2010, and especially between 2015 and 16. And that increase is a little faster than the statewide trend in the 2014 to 16 period. Looking at occupancy, we see that Lawrence General's occupancy, we don't see huge changes here, but it has declined somewhat since the affiliation. And here we have net patient service revenue per case mix adjusted discharge, which we see dipping down after the affiliation. Yes, and so cost per CMED, we also see following a similar pattern after 2014, dipping down.
So there's no strong evidence here that
Lawrence General, I have not, right, there's no evidence in either direction. Yeah, it's not. But I would just note that more years of data will be very helpful, and also continuing our examination of a lot more metrics and diving into these in more detail will allow us to make an assessment in a more robust way than we're even remotely able to today. So now we have Cambridge Health Alliance. Now Cambridge Health Alliance is a teaching hospital. It is not a community hospital, we all know that. It is in this slide deck because Cambridge Health Alliance affiliated with BIDCO as a contracting affiliate in 2014, and the underlying sort of basis for that affiliation was very similar to BIDCO's other contracting affiliations at that time, and shared the goal of keeping care at that hospital, at CHA, rather than having it at downtown AMCs. So in that spirit, we're examining it there, but CHA is not a, not a community hospital. So with that, we see that CHA also lost shares of community appropriate discharges after its affiliation with BIDCO. Meanwhile, all the other teaching hospitals and AMCs gained shares. I'll note that MGH's share went up 1 percentage point during this period, and that BidMIC's share of community appropriate discharges in this local area also ticked up. One thing that is important to note that is different here than in a lot of the other hospitals that we see is that CHA's share is lower than the share of all the teaching hospitals combined. Usually the blue line is above the orange line in most of these graphs, and I just want to note that we think is very much a geographic issue. So CHA's primary service area not only is near all of these AMCs, but includes parts of Boston. So we just want to be sure that's in context, that it's really overlapping PSA very directly with all of the AMCs, the Boston AMCs. So looking at Cambridge Health Alliance's share of the non-CAD discharges, the higher acuity discharges, we see it's really pretty stable. We can see a slight downtick after the affiliation in 2014. The main thing I want to note is we don't see this making up for the drops in the community appropriate side. Looking at the case mix index, we do see an increase, and so here I would compare its increase in CMI to the increase for other teaching hospitals and AMCs, which was a little bit lower. So Cambridge Health Alliance's increase was a little bit less than the increase for all teaching hospitals and AMCs combined, so it was going up. So when we look at their occupancy rate, we see, so putting aside that 2010-11 drop, which we're not certain why it's happening with that 2010 data point. But putting that aside for the moment, looking just at that 2014 to 2016 period, we do see that there is a drop, but not a huge one. And now on to net patient service revenues and case mix adjusted discharge. So there is a decline in that 2015 to 16 window. In general, this seems like a little bit of a noisier trend than what we see in some of the other graphs that we're looking at today. And for cost per CMAD, we see, between 14 and 16, there's, it goes down, it goes up, it's basically the same, pretty stable there. So we are now ready to talk about Anna Jake's Hospital. Anna Jake's also had a contracting affiliation with BIDCO in 2014. And as we've been seeing with these other contracting affiliates, there is a shrinking share of community appropriate discharges for the patients living in its service area, while teaching hospitals and AMCs were gaining shares. I'll note that BidMIC's share of community appropriate discharges here also grew during this time. And Partners AMC's shares ticked up just a little bit as well during this period. Looking at Anna Jake's share of the non-community appropriate discharges, we see a slight decline here as well. So we're not seeing an increase here that's making up for the decline on the community appropriate side. Turning to Anna Jake's case mix index, we do see that going up by a little bit less than the statewide community hospital average. And Anna Jake's occupancy rate is trending downward following the 2014 affiliation. Meanwhile, Anna Jake's net patient service revenue per CMAD, relatively stable during this period, maybe a slight decline, but pretty stable. And cost per case mix adjusted discharge during this period does tick up a bit, but not dramatically. We are now ready to look at Beth Israel Deaconess Milton.
Before you pass out, I'm not briefing.
Appreciate it.
It seems like if you were to, you don't have to go back to that, if you go back to the summary page. For the contracting affiliates, there's no strong evidence that movement. If anything,
Yeah, I think that we certainly don't see strong evidence of kind of positive directional changes But also want to say that, you know, these are all very recent affiliations, and so we don't have a lot of years of data. But you're right, we don't see strong evidence of a positive direction from this disease.
And as we keep looking at more metrics and diving into them, we will keep you posted if we find.
And that kind of takes us, that's a great transition to this next set of transactions that we're going to be looking at are corporate affiliates of the BI system. And so it's important to kind of think of them as kind of a different category of transaction.
Absolutely. So for Beaconsfield Deaconess Milton Hospital, which was acquired by Bidnick in 2012, we see between the last year before the transaction, so 2011 and 2016, Milton's share of community appropriate discharges was stable rather than declining. And we do see teaching hospitals and AMCs gaining shares of community appropriate discharges here during this period, but that rate of growth was slower than what we see for the statewide trend for those hospitals. Meanwhile, looking at the non-community appropriate category, we see that Milton experienced a slight increase in its share of these discharges. Beaconsfield Deaconess Medical Center's share increased as well during this time. Importantly, I'll note that Brigham and Women's Hospital's share went down during this period. MGH went up a little bit, but by less than Brigham went down. So in general, Partners AMCs had a declining share of these discharges during this
So
time.
this was substitution to the PI partners.
That is what this evidence seems to suggest to me, yes. Looking at BID Milton's case mix index, here you can tell from the slope of that line, we are looking at a much bigger jump than we've seen in any of these other graphs, and much bigger than the statewide community hospital trend during this period. Looking at Milton's occupancy rate, you know, going up and down a little bit more volatile, but trending upward during this period pretty consistently. And moving to look at net patient service revenue per CMED, we see a jump up immediately after the transaction from 12 to 13, and then pretty stable thereafter. On the cost per case mix adjusted,
And actually, just pausing there for a moment, I'll note you'll see this with one of the Leahy transactions coming up too, that this jump up in net patient service revenue the year following the transaction suggests that there could have been a price adjustment in that first year, and then it's a more gradual increase thereafter.
Yeah, but that's where it's kind of like commercial.
Exactly. And so obviously we're looking at this more directions, and so we'll be able to say more in the future, but at this point it suggests that could be a possibility.
Meanwhile, Milton's internal costs per case mix adjusted discharge are declining during this time. And we are now ready to turn to Beaconsfield Deaconess Plymouth, which was acquired by Bidnick in 2014. And here we see that Plymouth was losing shares of community appropriate discharges leading up to 2014, and then began to rebound afterwards. Hasn't caught up to where it was in 2009, but is rebounding. And that is different from the statewide trend of declines. Similarly, in the service area, teaching hospitals and AMCs were gaining shares, but slower than the statewide trend. Bidnick did gain community appropriate discharges here, and Partners AMCs did lose some share. So for the non-community appropriate category, again, we see a more gradual decline leading up to the transaction, and then a rebound afterwards. Beaconsfield Deaconess Medical Center gaining shares during this time, and Brigham and Women's losing shares during this time. Looking at Plymouth's case mix index, obviously you can see an increase between 2010 and 2013 that then levels off before the transaction. The increase after the transaction is slower than the statewide trend, but is still indeed trending upward. And Plymouth's occupancy rate follows a pattern pretty similar to what we were just looking at for the community appropriate discharges, where you see a decline and then a rebound after the transaction. Clement's net patient service revenue per CMAD, you don't see that immediate jump up that we saw for Milton after the transaction, but there is an uptick between 15 and 16. And for the cost per CMAD, here we do see an uptick right after the between the 15 and 16 years, but it's nothing dramatic there. We are now ready to talk about Leahy. So we're shifting to
Yeah, let's pause for a moment.
So these suggest certainly more changes in your patients are going for the institutions.
Yeah.
Although we're not certain about the place.
that's right. The magnitude of the shifts, the magnitude of the shifts is not enormous. We're talking about the biggest 1 year is 3%, and usually they're more like 1% or less. So you're not massive swings. Just
Part of the argument that the parties in this case is that if they consolidate, they'll be able to take volume from more expensive. So to the extent that we see that,
yeah.
we could eventually compare that to the extent that the price increase, that someone could say that well, there's a bigger impact on expense.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the type of analyses that we are working on currently.
Ready for Northeast, everyone? All right. There are only two more. It's Northeast and Winchester. For Northeast, we see after its acquisition by Leahy in 2012 that Beverly and Addison Gilbert hospitals experienced an increase in their share of community appropriate discharges, and that even after that decrease between 15 and 16, the Northeast hospitals did have higher shares of these discharges than they did before the transaction. Until that 2016 uptick that you see on the orange line, the share of community appropriate discharges at teaching hospitals and AMCs was really pretty stable in this primary service area. That 2016 uptick was appears to have been driven by an increase in discharges to Leahy from this area. Partners AMCs during this time, so from before the acquisition until 2016, gained shares coming out of this service area. For the non-community appropriate care, higher acuity discharges, Northeast experienced an increase in its share, and Leahy also gained shares of discharges here during this period. The partner hospitals stayed about the same. For Northeast Case Mix Index, we see an increase. It's a little less than the statewide increase, pretty similar. And for Northeast's occupancy rate, it's pretty stable. There's a gradual increase, a little bit of a drop in 16, but overall pretty stable during this time. The net patient service revenue per CMAD, like some of the other graphs we see this jump between 12 and 13, and then a more gradual increase thereafter. And for the costs per case mix adjusted discharge, we're staying in the same general range here. It's down a little bit, it's up a little bit, but where we end up is pretty similar to where we start, between 12 and 16 here. Which brings us to Winchester, which is the last hospital we're talking about today. Winchester was acquired by Leahy in 2014. And we see here that its pre-transaction trend of a decreasing share of community appropriate discharges seems to have stopped, sort of been arrested after the acquisition, and we see a slight increase in its share between 2014 and 2016. So that's different from what we see for community hospitals statewide losing shares. AMCs and teaching hospitals did gain shares of community appropriate care after the transaction, but that rate of change was slower than what we see for the statewide trend. I'll note that Leahy gained shares of community appropriate care from this area following the acquisition as well. And looking at the higher acuity discharges, there's a very similar sort of slight increase in Winchester's share of these local discharges. Baby's share also increased. Partners AMC's share ticked down very slightly, less than 1%. Turning to the case mix index, Winchester's case mix index has remained pretty stable during this time. The increase between 2014 and 16 was slower than what you saw for all community hospitals statewide during this time. And Winchester's occupancy rate has also really been pretty stable. We have an uptick, we have a downtick, it's really pretty similar between 14 and 16. And NPSR per CMAD has also really leveled off after the acquisition and been rising and has been stable since. And cost per case mix adjusted discharge seems to have dropped off after the acquisition after several years of increases. And that is the last one. Any other questions?
I love the quantitative analysis. What about the qualitative side? Sort of, do we know what's changed in these hospitals? We actually live in a community where a hospital was purchased and there was a lot of construction, branding, so the reputation of the hospital has certainly changed and improved, which would obviously affect some of these numbers. So are we looking at those items?
Absolutely. So, this is, as we kind of set up top, we wanted to share the trend lines, recognizing that these are all analyses in development. So they're not as kind of fully as comprehensive as normally when we present things when we're kind of at the end stage rather than kind of in progress. So you're right, we're looking, these are kind of outcomes, and then the next stage is looking at drivers. So what were the things that made the experience of contracting affiliates potentially different than corporate affiliates? What were some of the things that the Leahy system did that were different from the BI system? And, candidly, some of the things that we see different between Northeast and Winchester. What did Leahy do with Northeast that differed from Winchester? Obviously, Winchester was a more recent acquisition, so there's also the caveat that we have less time there. So definitely something that we are looking into.
Do we have access to the contracts between each parties of the large commercial?
We do, as part of our cost and market impact review, have the ability to request confidentially payer contracts.
So we could see whether these changes in patient service revenue are included associated with price increases or whether.
Correct, and we can see that in other data sources too. This is just one snapshot.
But if you go back to what the parties have said, one of the things they've said is that they think that by combining them, be able to save money on the back end. And so there's some evidence in some of these particular Winchester cases that they've said that they think they'll be able to move patients from higher price systems into their system, and so that would save the same. And there's some evidence of that. And then counteracting that would be any potential for increased prices associated with being a larger share. So to the extent we can quantify all of those with reference to the past transaction, that would give us a good, reasonable sense about what.
Absolutely, and I do want to note that the shifts are not just from more expensive systems, but from less expensive as well. And so looking at quantifying all of the shifts. Absolutely.
Other comments or questions?
Well, there will be much more on this in the future, so stay tuned. Thank you for bearing with us with all the charts, and we will turn it over to our research and cost trends team.
set up a fun exercise for all of us here.
Is this what you
No, this isn't. So we've mentioned a couple of times our work, the RCT team on provider organization practice variation. And what we're going to show today is the first installment of the richness of the data underlying this work. What we've been doing is, as we described before, attributing patients in the all-payer claims database to their provider organization and comparing those organizations based on what happens to those patients over the full course of their care in 2014 and 2015. I'm showing 2015 data today. So the chapter will touch on some of the highlights in the cost trends report, which will be released in about a month, of what we found in some of this work. Today, we'll be showing a portion of that. We're going to be going over differences across these organizations in the characteristics of those patients attributed to the organizations and in the spending. And in a later installment, we're going to be displaying the utilization, such as ED use, hospital use, and other categories of utilization of care. This data that we're going to preview today will be available to the full public with the next installment of our data points series, probably around early March. So we're going to show you what will be available there. And we're going to have Rachel describe the data, and someone else from our team, right in the back, is going to walk through the PowerPoint to show what will be available on the website for everyone to see. And today we're going to be covering 4 categories of information: patient demographics, health characteristics, insurance details, and spending of the patients attributed to these different provider organizations. We welcome any kinds of comments as we go through. So just to remind you of the data this is based on. This is Massachusetts residents only. We have about 1.4 million adult patients that are in the data we're showing today, attributed only to the payers Blue Cross, Harvard Pilgrim, and Tufts, only covered by those insurers, attributed to one of the 14 largest provider organizations in Massachusetts via their primary care providers. All the spending data we're going to show is risk adjusted using non-Hopkins ACG risk adjusted. So we're comparing like to like. Pausing there. Now I'm going to turn this over to Rachel and we'll show the website.
Thank you, David. I'm really pleased to be able to demo the Tableau visualizations of our provider organization practice variation work. This has definitely been a team effort led by Natasha Reese-McLaughlin developing the methodology and Shreya Gadan helping implement all of this data into Tableau. And some of these visualizations you've probably seen before in a static version, but we're going to walk through some of the capabilities that Tableau allows us to do, and you'll see in our data points. So this is the first graph at the top. You probably have seen this before. This is the number of attributed adult patients. Again, these are just adults in the commercial Blue Cross Blue Shield, Harvard Pilgrim, and Tufts. And you can see by provider organization the number of patients that we've been able to attribute. And the nice thing about using Tableau is that you can say, well, I wonder where do steward patients live? And if you click on the steward bar, which is the second highest that we've been able to attribute, then the map below will adjust and it'll show you the distribution of where the steward patients live in Massachusetts. And there may be a little delay as things are loading. But you can see that the majority of steward patients live in Metro South, and they're concentrated in the southern part of the state. And this is true for all the provider organizations, but the nice additional feature is that we can say, well, who are the other provider organizations who are working and serving the patients in Metro South? So if we scroll to the next set of graphs, we can see here's this map, and if we click on Metro South again, which I think is the yellow one, there you go, then the graph below will update and it will show you the provider organizations that are serving the different shares of patients in that region. So again, Steward is serving 43% of the patients, but other provider organizations, the smaller ones and the ones that weren't in RPO and SKNA, are also serving 17% of the patients there. Atrius, Partners, and South Shore also have large percentages. And one of the nice features is that we can select more or fewer provider organizations to look at if you're interested in, the top 8 That's a great question. So using the APCD and the Registry of Provider Organizations, we were able to attribute patients to 14 of the largest provider organizations in Massachusetts, and there were a couple others that were under 18,000 attributed patients that were too small for our analysis. So that is the primary source of the other group, and then a couple providers who we weren't able to roll up using RPO and SC. Excellent. So these two sets of graphs are talking about the income of the patient zip codes. We don't have income of the individual patients in our data, but each zip code in Massachusetts has an associated average income, and we bucketed those zip codes into 10 groups. Starting at the bottom, we have the lowest income zip codes, and that's on the left, and on the right, the highest income zip codes. So if you click on any provider organization, maybe South Coast, which has the lowest average income of their patient zip codes, you can see the distribution of where their patients live, and they have the highest share of their patients in the lowest income zip codes. And then if you scroll all the way to the other side on the right, you can see that they have a very small percent of their patients in the highest income zip codes. Now, if we look at Makaipa, for example, which has the highest average income for their patients, the distribution of where their patients live is very different, with the largest share of their patients in the highest income zip codes in the state, which is over $110,000 per year. So one of the factors that goes into calculating the risk score of a patient is age, and we see that the nice thing about Tableau is that we can sort of emphasize the relationship between these different metrics that we've been able to calculate. So if we look at risk score, we can see that Boston Medical Center, BMC, has the lowest risk score across the provider organizations that we've calculated. And this might be surprising, but then if you look at the share of the patients by age group, they have the highest share of their patients, adult patients, between 18 and 34. So we know that the lower age is related to a lower risk score, and this is what's driving part of their lower risk score. And as you move up the graph in terms of provider organizations with higher risk scores, you can see, for example, South Coast has a larger share of their population over the age of 55. And this again is just a commercial adult population. But we can understand some of what's contributing to calculating the risk score. And if we scroll down to the next set of graphs, another component of calculating risk score is whether or not your patients have any chronic conditions. So here we have a select number of the chronic illnesses in the APCD, and we can see with hypertension, for example, there is large variation across the provider organizations in terms of the share of their patients with hypertension. And again, we see South Coast, which had the highest risk score in the slides above, has a very high percent of their patients with hypertension compared to the other provider organizations. And we're able to look at other chronic illnesses as well. For the sake of time, let's move on to the next step. And this is actually in reference to the conversation we had with Commissioner Altman. I don't know if people remember that we wanted to look at the insurance networks that the different patients are in across provider organizations. So we took a deeper dive, and here we have the share of patients in HMO and POX plans. And there is some variation, with partners having 66% of their patients in these plans, and Reliant having almost 80%. So there's some variation. And if you click on, for example, Reliant, the graph below updates, and you can see the distribution of the 3 commercial payers and how the share of the patients that they are covering. So when we think about the patient demographics of these provider organizations, we see that there is a large amount of variation, and we want to make sure we're accounting for that when we look at spending numbers. So as we said before, all of the spending numbers we're showing are adjusted for risk score of their patient populations. So the variation of spending that we're seeing here for total spending is not due to any underlying variation in the risk scores or the health of their patients. And we see that Partners is $1,500 more expensive than Reliant overall. And then we can do a deeper dive and look at the category of service for these different types of spending. And so these provider organizations are ordered in the same way as above, with partners being the highest spending and Reliant being the lowest. But now we break it out into the different types of spending. And we can see some trends emerge. If we click just on the hospital outpatient spending, it is clear that this is following a very similar trend, that partners have the highest outpatient spending. And Reliant and the other hospital or provider organization systems who are physician-led and don't have hospitals in their system have some of the lower hospital outpatient spending. And this makes sense. If you click on hospital inpatient spending, on the other hand, there's less of a clear trend in variation across these provider organizations, and this is probably not driving the difference in total spending across the provider organizations. We also calculated, if we scroll down to the next graph, this is the cost sharing, across these provider organizations as well, and it follows a very similar trend, with partners having the highest, and Boston Medical Center, South Coast Reliant having some of the lower cost sharing. And finally, we're able to take an even deeper dive and look at some of the categories of hospital outpatient and inpatient spending, with laboratory spending and radiology spending. And this is a nice thing that Tableau lets us do, that we can compare them combined, we can look at them separately, and we can look at the different provider organizations in terms of their categories as well, their system organization, whether or not they have hospitals in their system. So here we could compare the AMC anchored hospitals just across each other.
And that's available in all of the spending categories, that ability to pre-select.
Excellent. So this is a preview of what you'll be able to do on your own when we release our data points. And if you're itching to get some access to data in the meantime, you should check out our previous data points that are already on our website.
Yeah,
Are there any questions? Good question. We have 2014 data worked up in the same manner. We can discuss that. We haven't decided definitively on whether we can show that. So I think that's probably something we can do there.
I mean, there are all sorts of.
Yeah. Great.
If it was easy, it would be worth doing. It's hard.
Yeah. Once we have this set up in place, it's
Next up, we have our registration provider organizations team talking about the 2015 data submission manual. Obviously, those data are key to some of the Tableau information you just saw in terms of how to figure out how the different providers roll up into the system.
Thank you, Kate. And for those that don't know me, I'm Liz Reedy. I'm a program manager on the market performance team here. So the MARPO program is a data collection program designed to map the structures and relationships of Massachusetts' largest health systems. It is a joint program with GIA, and both agencies are involved in developing and prioritizing reporting requirements. To date, we have collected information on organizations' corporate structures, contracting and clinical relationships, lists of owned facilities, physician rosters, and financial information. We received the 2017 filing in October and are continuing to review submissions. The data collected in the MARPO program are important to health system transparency, and in particular, being able to track and analyze system-wide and provider-specific trends over time. All of the data are public. The 2015 dataset is posted on our website,
and we anticipate releasing the 2017 dataset later this spring. Slide 63 lists some of the stakeholders and ways we're aware of the MARPO data being used. For instance, as you just heard about how the dataset is being used in the cost trends report provider practice variation work. In October, we put out 2 proposed updates for public comment. We had proposed improving an existing data element to better capture information about facility fees paid to provider organizations, as well as requiring organizations to report NPs, PAs, and certified nurse midwives in the provider roster. We received comments from 9 organizations during the public comment period. Their names are listed on slide 65. We wanted to take a moment to extend our sincere thanks to these organizations for providing thoughtful and insightful feedback on our proposal. Slide 66 highlights comments that organizations provided. In particular, providers noted that preparing for the MassHealth ACO implementation is a priority, and therefore this is a particularly burdensome time for us to be adding new data elements to the filing requirements. Providers also noted that there is pending state legislation on facility fees, as well as nurse practitioner scope of practice that may impact data elements that we were proposing to collect. Lastly, organizations noted that they prefer a summer submission deadline rather than a fall deadline due to many competing priorities in the fall, such as the RPO program with the Division of Insurance and many hospital and health system fiscal year ends. The key program value is to weigh the reporting burden with the utility of the data set to end users. Based on the comments received and subsequent discussions with end users, we recommend no additions to the facilities file or the provider roster at this time. We are also recommending a summer submission deadline. We're also recommending minor technical edits to improve the corporate affiliations file and the physician roster, and removing the statement of cash flows from the financial statements file to align with CHIA's hospital financial reporting requirements. And lastly, we're updating our guidance for reporting out-of-state entities, and the following slides contain some additional background information on this issue along with our specific recommendations.
Before we do the out-of-state
Sure.
reporting, should we, oh, this is separate from the out-of-state transactions.
Correct. So those 2 things kind of speak to each other. Obviously, these are interrelated programs, but this is a new standard for RPO.
Maybe it's just worth pausing to see whether people have comments. Or in terms of delaying the addition of factors. I sort of feel like there's a lot of other things going on. You could really use not having that other thing go on. That seems like it makes a lot of sense.
They're certainly on the table as high priority additions at some future reporting cycle, whether that's next year or another future year.
So,
Would you like to take questions?
Oh, my first time. Sorry. It's fine.
Okay, yeah.
My first time here.
Yeah,
Hi, I'm
it's
Ellen,
okay.
a nurse practitioner, OBGYN family. My background is integrated medicine and addiction medicine. So mid-level providers are not included in this data at this time.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Having participated once, we can now call on you for any future examination.
Yeah. Step up, because I'm ready. It's just that it's remarkable to me how, in how much mid-level providers are asked to do in scope of practice, and how much policy guidelines don't. The business model, what do we preach to the choir? The business model does not match the medical model in our scope of practice in the state of Massachusetts. And that's kind of why I'm here, is to find out when I go to see data, and I also am a small business owner in integrated medicine for 30 years I've been doing this. I'm just here to help, or whatever we can do to support each other to give good patient care and really mainstream care for addiction medicine for patients popping in and out of systems and make it cost effective. So if anybody, I'm there for the first time. I don't know, but I'm here to help in any way that I kind of support. But I think that data for nurse practitioners needs to be in cost because I go to interviews or I see physicians and for a mid-level provider, doctors are making twice as much money per hour as I'm making, and they want me to do the same scope of practice as them. And I've also taught nursing in nursing school, and our scope of practice and what we're being taught, and sending out new nurse practitioners into the workforce, is not matching what is happening. So we need to give patients good care and mainstream it. You know. So if anybody has any comments or anything, I'd love to kind of get in on it.
David, Rebecca, did you want to say something about our sort of practice work?
I'll just note that we spoke to this issue in our cost trends report a couple of years ago that we presented on nurse practitioners scope of practice. And I will say in the presentation you just saw, we acknowledge that the nurse practitioners are not in the RPO data. We brought in a commercial data set that does include them so that we can attribute patients who are seeing nurse practitioners as their primary care providers. So probably 700-800 were included in that last presentation to be able to capture those costs and those patients.
Yeah, and I think efforts are being made to make templates more user-friendly in clinical practice because we're doing the same, we're inputting the same data. We're required to see, okay, you have to see in addiction medicine, you have to see 4 patients every 15 minutes, blah, blah, you have to do the whole thing, yet the same data background we're required to do for MDs. We our scope of practice and trying to have a conversation with a doctor or a business person needs to be the policy needs. I'm happy to help with the policy.
Thank you.
Cut me off.
Yeah, we
you.
certainly look forward to further discussions about scope of practice issues, and obviously this is a high priority area. It was why it was initially proposed as part of RPO reporting this year, recognizing that there is some pending legislation there. We're just hitting pause on it for this year, and also recognizing some feedback from provider organizations, which I think highlights some of the issues around scope of practice. Some of the provider organizations say that they don't actually track the information about their advanced practice practitioners or non-MDs in the same way. So, great area for future work. Let's move on to talk about the out-of-state reporting standards.
So in reviewing our initial registration materials, we found that provider organizations generally fell into 2 categories: Massachusetts-based systems and large national systems that were largely operating outside of Massachusetts. We created the limited reporting requirements for these large national systems to focus the reporting on Massachusetts. Since initial registration, there have been out-of-state acquisitions by Mass-based systems, which you may be aware from our notices of material change filings, and these systems have been looking for guidance on what to report in their RPO filings regarding any out-of-state entities. Prior to 2018, there were no limitations on reportable entities for Massachusetts-based systems. For the 2018 filing, we are planning to apply the same reporting requirements to all provider organizations. We will require detailed reporting of mass-based entities and require qualitative descriptions of out-of-state facilities and physicians. The appendix of your slide deck lists the specific updates proposed for each file. And again, the rationale is to create consistent requirements for all organizations and to focus the reporting on Massachusetts. This decision was made following a series of conversations with both data reporters and end users, and again, weighing the reporting burden on providers with the usefulness of the data set. We do not anticipate that this update will have a significant impact on the data set. For instance, we applied the proposed updates to the 2015 data and have identified very little data that will be lost. No out-of-state facilities were reported by Massachusetts-based systems in 2015, and also of the over 22,000 physicians in the physician roster, approximately 250, or about 1%, may not be required to be reported in the future. I'll pause for questions on the out-of-state reporting update before talking about any timing and resources for the 2018 filing. The 2018 filing will be due this summer. All data that provider organizations submitted in last year's filing will be pre-populated in the online submission platform, which is the system that provider organizations use to submit their data. Provider organizations will review their prior submission and make any necessary updates. We'll also offer training sessions throughout the state, one-on-one meetings to answer individual organizations' questions, and anticipate releasing frequently asked questions and other guidance as needed. In terms of timing, we are planning to release the final 2018 data submission manual and filing templates in the coming weeks. These will be posted on our website and sent via email to everyone on the program's listserv. We anticipate scheduling training sessions and one-on-one meetings, as well as opening the online submission platform later this spring, with filings due in the summer.
Any questions about the RPO program?
A couple of years ago, we kept getting suggestions of which one we think this program would just stop it. Which we think this is I think that has that.
I would say yes. I think we've tried to make it a priority to really work with provider organizations on their filing, and I would say to date I have not heard anyone complaining that they just didn't want it to exist.
And to the contrary, we've actually received a great deal of positive feedback from provider organizations about the team here at the HPC. We put a lot of time and effort into assisting provider organizations to minimize the burden, and we have a technical assistance group that involves a number of the provider organizations to help craft the reporting standards to be as easy to comply with as possible. Moving on to our last agenda item, we wanted to provide an update on reporting out-of-state transactions. So obviously, as Commissioner Cutler noted, this is interrelated with out-of-state reporting for the Registration of Provider Organizations program. But here we're talking about transactions that would be reportable to us as material change notices. So I will turn it over to my deputy, Megan Wolf, to walk through the proposal.
Thank you, Kate. The HPC's review of provider transactions focuses on impacts in Massachusetts, but in some cases, these transactions include entities outside of the state. Of the 90 notices we have received to date, 5 have been acquisitions of or mergers with out-of-state entities. These include the acquisition of St. Francis Hospital in Connecticut by Trinity Health, which owns Mercy Medical Center, the proposed merger between South Coast Health and Care New England in Rhode Island, the acquisition of Wentworth Douglas Hospital in New Hampshire by Partners, and the acquisitions of IASIS Healthcare in Tennessee and 8 community health systems hospitals in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida by Steward. The HPC issued a frequently asked questions in 2015, inviting market participants to contact us if they had a question about whether a proposed transaction would require the filing of a notice of material change. Since then, we have been iterating internally with commissioners as well as our contracted experts and with market participants to refine our guidance. As a brief refresher, one of the transaction types for which the HPC requires notice is a merger with or acquisition of or by a hospital system, and this includes out-of-state hospital systems. The HPC interprets hospital system to mean either 2 or more corporately affiliated hospitals, or 1 hospital and at least 1 other corporately affiliated entity that provides healthcare services. Based on the discussions staff have had with commissioners, other experts, and stakeholders, and recognizing that the focus of HPC's review is on impacts in Massachusetts, staff recommend at this time limiting those out-of-state transactions that require notice to us to those in which a Massachusetts provider or provider organization plans to acquire or merge with a hospital system in New England or New York. The acquisition of in-state providers or provider organizations would always require notice, regardless of whether the purchaser is in or out of state. We are planning to issue guidance to clarify these requirements, and we are planning to bring it to the board at the next board meeting. As always, we welcome inquiries from market participants regarding whether a transaction they are planning would require notice, and I open it up to questions now.
In this case, so our purview is always limited to the geographic boundaries of Massachusetts. So by which I mean, like, for example, partners discussions with Pierre and Rhode Island. We have no issue associated with what happens to medical spending in Rhode Island, except insofar as that affected the spending of Massachusetts residents.
Our trigger for a cost to market impact review is whether or not there's anticipated to be a significant impact to healthcare costs or market functioning in Massachusetts.
For Massachusetts residents.
In Massachusetts, whether you're defining that to be residents or
But we wouldn't,
some other way.
but we wouldn't, what I'm trying to say is, suppose that someone believed that that would result in a number of people living in Rhode Island coming to Massachusetts. We have no issue with that at all, that's what people in Rhode Island.
The primary issue there probably would be Rhode Island. I could foresee some tangential way that could impact
But
the
so
healthcare
we
market
would
in
not do
Massachusetts.
anything on the basis of any impact on the residents of Rhode Island.
Correct.
We would only do something based on the impact on residents of Massachusetts.
Correct. That would be the requirement to then move forward with a CMIR. Obviously, notice also has an important transparency component. So I do just want to be clear that the purpose of notice is not solely to determine whether or not we need to move forward with the CMIR.
The material change notices typically focus on acquisitions or affiliations. But there's also situations where I'm thinking about national chains that find themselves either the subject of federal action or just changes in their own investment strategies that could impact Massachusetts hospitals around access to capital. Are we monitoring that in any way, or is that something that we should be thinking about for material change notices?
That's a great flag. So we have a set number of categories of transactions that really come before us. And so it's generally two different providers or a provider and a payer coming together in some way that triggers notice to us. We certainly have other avenues to monitor changes to the market, both at the HPC and within other state agencies. So I think it would depend a lot on the details of what was going on, but it may not hit one of those specific transactional triggers for a material change notice at this time.
So, Kate, clearly your recommendation here is that it's geographic based. You know, the filing requirements will continue for New England and New York. Do we know, do many Massachusetts residents receive their care outside of Massachusetts now, where they go over the border to facilities in other states?
We have done some analyses looking at that issue. We're a little bit hampered by data sources in other states. By and large, as you would expect, folks who live close to borders are more likely to go out of state, but we actually don't see huge numbers in either direction. Folks from out of state coming into Massachusetts routinely. Obviously, we have AMCs and teaching hospitals that are some of the best in the world, where folks will come here for specialty care, but kind of routinely crossing borders is not something that we see in large amounts in either direction. Again, with caveats that this is based on limited data.
So we do not need to vote on this.
We do not need to vote on this. We do plan to bring it up at the next board meeting, but the proposal would be to issue it as sub-regulatory guidance, really clarifying the regulation And this is our current interpretation of the regulation, and so this is in effect currently. And if folks have questions, they should reach out to us. Right.
We have our scheduled meetings set for the year. Can you just flash us that? So these are, as currently scheduled, all of our meetings. If just thinking about this schedule, if I recall correctly, on Wednesday, April 25th board meeting, that's when we would vote to approve the release of the preliminary CMIR for PI ranking at all.
That is our tentative expectation. So, we are subject to statutory timelines that are dependent on when the parties complete their production to us. We're still engaging in that back and forth, so we're not on a ticking clock quite yet. But our current expectation is April 25th.
Are we going to need another, so you predicted something important. Are we going to need another board meeting for that, given the 30 days?
It's entirely possible, but we don't know yet.
Alright, so I suppose we should be prepared to know.
We may have to be flexible with the preliminary report and the final report. And in some cases in the past, we've been able to work with the parties to not have to schedule, but it may be that the preliminary report ends up being a little bit later than April 25th, in which case maybe the July works out, but it's hard to speculate right now on that.
So we have a few extra minutes. Let me open it up for questions, comments from anyone. Yes.
Hi, Kathy Keough, Atrius Health. I just wanted to thank the team for sort of listening to the providers and helping to do the RPO filing. It certainly makes a huge difference for us, and I just wanted to give a big shout out. So we could plan when we need to, and give good shout outs when it's
Thank you, Kathy.
I was happy to hear the response. The volume of work has not been what people fear. Very good. If there's nothing else, then I think we will adjourn a little early. And we're going to have 15 minutes.
We do have another packed agenda for our next committee meeting at 11, so we're going to start very promptly at 11. So go grab some coffee and come back here.